Julia Roberts has been more than just a movie star for decades. She became the shining light of Hollywood, known for her beautiful smile and natural charm that made her America's favorite actress. She ruled romantic comedies and touched the hearts of millions of people around the world. Her warm presence and infectious laugh became part of our shared memories. But behind that golden glow, there were deep wounds that most people never saw. Behind every bright smile, there was hidden pain. Behind every graceful step, there was a woman walking on broken glass from private struggles. The glittering lights and glamour hid someone carrying sorrows that time couldn't heal. Now at 57 years old, life's storms still follow her. There's a cold, consuming pain that threatens to break the peace she spent her whole life trying to build. The story begins with a little girl growing up in the shadows of heartbreak. Julia Fiona Roberts was born on October 28, 1967 in Smyrna, Georgia. Her parents, Walter Grady Roberts and Betty Lou Breed, were actors who did something brave and unusual for their time. They opened one of the first acting schools in the segregated South that welcomed both black and white children. This bold stand for equality impressed civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King so much that they quietly paid Julia's hospital bill when she was born. But having courage in public couldn't protect the family from problems at home. Money was always tight, and the stress put heavy pressure on Walter and Betty Lou's marriage. By 1971, when Julia was just 4 years old, their marriage fell apart completely. For the little girl with big brown eyes, the dream of a safe and loving home was shattered overnight. The divorce brought a deep wound that would never fully heal. When her father moved out, Julia felt an emptiness that nothing could fill, even though he stayed devoted to his children. Soon after, Betty Lou married a man named Michael Moats, and Julia's childhood home became a place of tension and fear. What should have been a fresh start became a darker time. Loud arguments and slamming doors replaced comfort and peace. Neighbors later remembered that police were called to the house more than once. Julia, along with her older brother Eric and sister Lisa, learned to walk carefully through their childhood, never knowing when the next explosion might happen. The family moved from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough for Julia to feel stable. The constant stress affected her ability to speak. As a child, she developed a stutter, with each word catching in her throat as if trapped by the fear around her. Teachers noticed the quiet girl who avoided speaking and seemed to shrink under the weight of feelings she couldn't express. It was only later, with speech therapy and eventually acting, that she began to find her voice again. In 1976, a new half-sister, Nancy, was born into the same troubled household. But this addition only highlighted how broken and burdened the family had become. The Roberts children didn't grow up dreaming of Hollywood fame. Instead, they lived with financial struggles, constant moving, and the pain of broken promises. For Julia, the house that should have been her safe place often felt like a stage where fear and uncertainty were the main performers. Nothing prepared her for the cruelest blow of all. In 1977, when Julia was just 10 years old, her father Walter was taken from her by throat cancer. He had hidden his illness, trying to protect his little girl from the truth, and then he was gone suddenly. For Julia, it was devastating and heartbreaking. The one person who had given her unconditional love and safety was torn away forever. She fell into silence, unable to find her voice, in a world where her anchor no longer existed. The house grew colder and emptier. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo with his absence. Every corner reminded her of love lost too soon. But in his final act of love, Walter left behind a precious gift. Before his death, he had recorded cassette tapes of bedtime stories so his daughter would never be alone at night. Julia would press play in the dark, curling up in a ball, holding the recorder as if it were her father's hand. She clung to that voice as if those fragile tapes were lifelines against the silence. They proved that love could reach beyond death. Years later, she admitted that she listened to those tapes until they wore out completely, playing them again and again as if wearing them thin might somehow keep him alive a little longer. Those tapes became both her comfort and her torment, the warmth of his presence, and the unbearable truth that his voice was all she had left. School offered no escape from her pain. Her wide, bright smile, the very smile that would one day captivate the world, was cruelly mocked by classmates who called her toothy. What millions would later celebrate as beautiful was, in those fragile years, her deepest source of shame. Yet even within all this wreckage of loss, ridicule, and fear, Julia discovered a spark that refused to die. Acting, first in her imagination and later on small stages, became the place where her trembling voice grew strong, where the lonely child could turn heartbreak into expression. The tragedies that could have silenced her forever instead built her strength. The grief of losing her father, the scars of an unstable home, and the sting of childhood cruelty carved into her a depth of feeling that would one day make her not just America's sweetheart, but an actress whose performances carried the weight of real pain. These wounds would whisper their truth long after the stage lights had dimmed. Out of the silence of her broken childhood, a dream began to burn. It was fragile but unbreakable, and it carried Julia Robb, Ertz from the shattered rooms of Georgia to the harsh streets of New York City. In 1985, at just 17 years old, she arrived with nothing but a small bag, a few $100s, and a heart full of stubborn hope. She stepped off the bus into a winter that cut to the bone. The wind slashed through her thin coat, and the city seemed designed to test anyone weak enough to give up. Her apartment was cramped and drafty, with a heater that coughed more than it worked, leaving her to shiver through nights that felt endless. She learned to eat very little, stretching cheap meals over several days. The hollow ache of hunger became a constant companion. She shared crowded rooms with strangers and clutched blankets against the icy air. When subway fare was too expensive, she walked miles through snow-covered streets in shoes worn thin. Each step was a battle against the bitter cold. Her breath rose in clouds before her, a reminder that the world outside was as unforgiving as the world within her heart. Every door she knocked on seemed to slam shut. Casting agents barely looked up before dismissing her. Modeling calls ended in silence. Opportunities dissolved like snow under her feet. More than 200 times, the answer was no. Yet each rejection only made her more determined. In the quiet of those freezing nights, with hunger gnawing at her stomach and loneliness pressing in from all sides, Julia whispered to herself the same defiant promise: try again. Her first breaks were small, but meaningful. She landed a commercial for Clearasil, just a fleeting smile on a screen, but it gave her a union card, proof that she had a place, however small, in the world she desperately wanted to join. In 1987, she earned her first television role in Crime Story. The part lasted only one episode, but she showed up with a fever burning through her body, determined not to fail. On set, special effects left her with burns and scars on her skin that mirrored the unseen wounds she already carried. But she refused to let them stop her. During this time, Julia faced a heartbreaking choice that no young person should ever have to make: survival or memory. The cupboards were empty, her stomach was hollow, and the city's cold pressed in like an enemy that never slept. In her hands, she held the one treasure that still smelled faintly of safety: her father's antique watch, its metal worn smooth from the warmth of his hand. To sell it was unthinkable. Yet hunger and desperation left her no choice. With trembling fingers, she slid it across the pawn shop counter, her tears blurring the face of the watch as if time itself was weeping with her. In that moment, it felt as if she had lost him all over again. The last connection to her father was being severed by the price of rent. The clerk counted out the bills without caring, but to Julia, each crumpled note felt like betrayal, like selling her heart to keep her body alive. She walked out clutching the cash, but inside she carried a wound that went down to the bone, a hollow that no amount of food could fill. Years later, when fame and fortune finally came, she searched for that watch and bought it back. She never wore it as jewelry. It was never just an ornament. It was a scar turned into a symbol, proof that she had crawled through hunger, humiliation, and despair, and returned carrying her father's legacy intact. Then came the films that would lift her out of anonymity. Mystic Pizza in 1988 was a small role, but her fierce energy caught the attention of critics who saw something undeniable in her. Roger Ebert himself called her a major beauty with fierce energy, predicting her future stardom. Still, the struggle didn't vanish overnight. On Steel Magnolias in 1989, she was cast as Shelby, a young bride battling illness, a role steeped in fragility and strength. She wasn't the first choice, and on set, she faced tough criticism and relentless pressure, that tested her confidence to the core. There were days when the weight of expectation made her weep, but she never walked away. Instead, she poured every memory of loss, every bruise of rejection into Shelby. The result was hauntingly real, a performance that cut straight to the bone. At only 22 years old, Julia Roberts won a Golden Globe and earned her first Oscar nomination. What should have broken her, the hunger, the cold, the rejections, the ridicule, became instead the furnace that shaped her strength. From the frozen streets of New York to the blazing lights of Hollywood, Julia carried proof that even in the face of despair, a fragile dream can endure. Her rise wasn't born of privilege or ease, but of sacrifice, determination, and a refusal to let the world put out the fire inside her. In those early years, long before she became America's sweetheart, Julia Roberts was simply a young woman walking through snow and hunger, clutching a battered dream that would not die, a dream that would soon make her unforgettable. Out of this furnace of struggle came the role that would change everything. In 1990, Julia Roberts stepped into Pretty Woman, and Hollywood would never be the same. But the fairy tale began in shadows. The script had once been a dark story with no happy ending. Even after Disney softened it into modern magic, Julia's future hung by a thread. The production company collapsed, forcing her to audition again as if her destiny could vanish in a single meeting. Even Richard Gere hesitated to work with her until Julia, with both playfulness and quiet desperation, slid him a note that read, "Please say yes." He did, and in that moment, history took root. Her paycheck was modest, just a fraction of her co-star's earnings, the echoes of Hollywood's gender imbalance ringing loud. She walked onto the set not as royalty, but as a Cinderella whose glass slipper was pure determination. When the cameras rolled, the world saw something it could never forget. The same wide smile once mocked, in schoolyards now disarmed millions. In the red dress, in the elevator with that irrepressible laugh, Julia Roberts stopped being just an actress. She became a phenomenon. Pretty Woman soared past hundreds of millions at the box office. But more than money, it rewrote culture itself. Women copied her fashion. Couples believed in fairy tale love again. Even Beverly Hills became a tourist destination. The world had crowned a new America's sweetheart, and she had carved the title out of vulnerability, grit, and light. But while Vivian Ward found her happy ending on screen, Julia discovered that life off-screen offered no such guarantees. Fame was intoxicating yet merciless. She had become engaged to Dylan McDermott, but under the relentless flash of cameras and headlines, their promise of love collapsed. She would later confess that being celebrated everywhere sometimes felt like belonging to everyone and no one at the same time. It was her first brutal lesson in stardom's cost. You cannot cradle both a private life and a public dream without sacrifice. Determined not to be confined to fairy tales, she sought out roles that demanded risk, even when they left her emotionally drained. Sleeping with the Enemy in 1991 plunged her into the terror of a woman escaping an abusive relationship, and she admitted the emotional toll lingered after the cameras stopped. Dying Young that same year asked her to inhabit a love story steeped in loss, and though critics were divided, audiences saw the vulnerability beneath her performance. These years were not effortless triumphs. They were crucibles. She stumbled. She wept in trailers between takes, but she rose again. Each role became a battle scar, each project a reminder that resilience was not born in ease, but in fire. Then came the second coronation. By the late 1990s, Julia Roberts was not just the girl from Pretty Woman. She was the reigning queen of romantic comedy. My Best Friend's Wedding in 1997 broke tradition, giving her a character who was flawed, desperate, and achingly human. And audiences adored her honesty. Notting Hill in 1999 blurred the line between art and life, with Julia portraying a world-famous actress who falls for an ordinary man, an echo of her own yearning for simplicity amid chaos. Runaway Bride reunited her with Richard Gere, rekindling the chemistry that once electrified screens. These films didn't just succeed, they became part of the language of love for an entire generation. etching her smile and spirit deeper into collective memory. Then came the moment that shattered ceilings. In 2000, Julia Roberts embodied Erin Brockovich, a single mother who refused to bow to power. She was raw, unvarnished, a force of defiance. For the first time in history, a woman in Hollywood commanded $20 million for a single role. What had begun with a paycheck smaller than her male co-stars in Pretty Woman had transformed into a triumph of equality. Julia stood not only for herself, but for every woman in the industry, proving that talent and star power demanded respect. The film grossed over $250 million worldwide. Critics praised her ferocity, and the Academy placed its golden statue in her hands. Standing on stage, overwhelmed, she laughed through tears and declared, "I'm just a girl from Smyrna, Georgia, and here I am." It was more than victory. It was vindication, the ultimate answer to every doubt that had ever shadowed her path. By 2001, her films had reached staggering box office heights, making her one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood history. Yet her true legacy was never about numbers. It was about proving that a girl who once walked through snow with holes in her shoes, who pawned her father's watch to survive, could rise to the world's brightest sun, tag, and change the very rules of the game. Julia Roberts was no longer just America's sweetheart. She had become a beacon of resilience, proof that even wounds carved in childhood could be transformed into light. Her smile had become a symbol of healing, her career a testament that fragility and strength could exist in the same soul. In that balance, greatness was born. Even as the world crowned her America's sweetheart, Julia's heart stumbled through storms of its own. There were fragile engagements, fractured dreams, and the cruel reminder that love under fame's merciless gaze could vanish faster than it bloomed. In the earliest days of her rise, she found herself briefly connected to actor Liam Neeson. He was older, steady, already seasoned by life, carrying a wisdom that seemed to quiet the turbulence still lingering from her fractured childhood. Their romance didn't last long, but it burned with rare intensity. Friends later recalled how Julia softened in his company, how he brought out a thoughtful side hidden beneath her radiant smile. Though she would later describe that chapter as fleeting, she admitted it left an indelible mark, teaching her that love could be both shelter and storm. That tenderness and the ache of its passing bled into her early work, giving her performances a depth that critics marveled at. But if Liam Neeson was a quiet chapter of discovery, Dylan McDermott became the dazzling headline of a fairy tale that collapsed under fame's unblinking glare. Just as her career was tipping from promise into phenomenon, Julia and Dylan fell headlong into passion. Within months, they were engaged, and for Julia, the promise of marriage meant more than romance. It was the fragile hope of normalcy, of anchoring herself to something steady while her life was being pulled into superstardom. Yet Hollywood's spotlight proved merciless. Paparazzi followed their every step. Tabloid covers turned their rivate whispers into public theater. The ring on her finger, meant to be a symbol of intimacy, became a headline. What should have been tender evenings planning a shared future instead became a performance she never auditioned for. Under that pressure, the dream cracked. Within a year, the engagement was over. For Julia, it was not only heartbreak, but a brutal education in the cost of fame. She later confessed the paradox of it all. You're celebrated everywhere you go, but it can feel like you belong to everyone and no one at the same time. It was her first great lesson that the life of America's sweetheart came with a hidden price, that in reaching for love, she might always have to share it with the world. Even as Hollywood crowned her its brightest star, Julia Roberts stepped into a love story that shimmered like a dream and promised to be the fairy tale the world was waiting for. In the early 1990s, her career was ascending like fire. Pretty Woman had made her America's sweetheart, her smile lighting up billboards and headlines across the globe. To the world, she seemed to have everything. Yet behind the velvet curtain of fame, Julia's heart was quietly writing its own story. At its center stood actor Kiefer Sutherland, magnetic and compelling, whose charm matched her radiance. Together, Julia and Kiefer became Hollywood's golden couple. Their laughter was captured in photographs, their passion spilling across red carpets and intimate dinners. To those who looked on, it wasn't just love. It was destiny unfolding in real time. The plans for their wedding were nothing short of spectacular. Gold-embossed invitations were sent to an elite guest list. Designers whispered of gowns shimmering in ivory. Flowers were ordered in cascades, and the date was circled as the wedding that would stop Hollywood. Tabloids ran sketches of her imagined dress. Fans spoke of her aid, as if she were already a bride, and the image of Julia walking down the aisle captured imaginations far beyond the industry. But behind the spectacle, Julia was quietly building dreams of her own. She tried on gowns during fittings and allowed herself, for once, to imagine forever. Friends remembered how her eyes softened whenever she spoke of the vows she hoped to write by hand. Words meant not for the cameras, but for Kiefer alone. For Julia, who had grown up in fractured homes, who had carried silence and loss since age 10, this wedding wasn't about headlines. It was the fragile, trembling hope of finally creating a sanctuary of her own. But love beneath the spotlight is the most fragile of all. As June 1991 approached, the storybook romance began to fray at the edges. Whispers filled the air. Rumors of Kiefer being seen with another woman. Murmurs that the two were too young, too overwhelmed by fame's furnace to carry the weight of forever. Neither Julia nor Kiefer ever confirmed the stories, but the noise grew deafening. Then, 3 days before the wedding that was to stop Hollywood, Julia made the choice that would define her. She walked away. The shock reverberated like an earthquake. What was meant to be a celebration of love became its funeral. The gowns stitched in ivory hung untouched in silence. The flowers ordered in cascades began to wilt in their vases. The altar stood waiting, decorated for vows that would never be spoken. Cameras descended like vultures. Tabloids screamed of betrayal and cowardice, and the world feasted on her sorrow. Julia's heartbreak was no longer hers alone. It was laid bare for millions, a private wound turned into public theater. And yet behind the frenzy, there was only silence. The flowers still perfumed the air, the gown still hung in its box, but the dream they had been meant to honor had already dissolved. Alone in a quiet room, Julia was no longer America's sweetheart, no longer the bride the world had imagined. She was simply a young woman with trembling hands, staring at an empty future where her safe haven had vanished before it could ever be built. She would later confess with unflinching honesty, "Walking away was the hardest thing I had ever done, but I knew it was the only right thing to do." Those words carried the weight of someone who had torn herself in two, between the fairy tale the world demanded and the truth her heart could not ignore. In time, Kiefer himself would echo the same truth, calling her choice courageous and admitting the strength it took to step away from something that no longer felt right. For another person, the canceled wedding might have meant ruin. For Julia, it became the crucible that deepened her art. On screen, she carried that pain like an invisible weight. Critics saw in her performances a trembling vulnerability that felt lived rather than acted. The heartbreak of 1991 had carved into her a chamber of truth, and from it she poured performances that audiences recognized as searingly real. In the wake of heartbreak, Julia reached for companionship. For a brief time, it came in the form of actor Jason Patric. Their connection was never destined for legend. It was a fleeting attempt at comfort, a hand to hold while the ground beneath her still trembled. Then, in 1993, came a turn that startled even those closest to her. Julia Roberts, America's sweetheart, slipped quietly into a small Indiana church and exchanged vows with country singer Lyle Lovett. It was a whirlwind, unexpected, almost cinematic in its swiftness. She wore simple white, he wore cowboy boots, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed she had chosen an entirely different script. Headlines gasped in surprise, but to Julia, it wasn't a spectacle. It was another grasp for belonging. The marriage was tender, but brief. Less than 2 years later, the union quietly dissolved. There was no scandal, no feud, only mutual recognition that their love wasn't built to last. By the mid-1990s, Julia Roberts had lived through romances that shimmered and shattered, an engagement abandoned, and a marriage that flickered out as quickly as it began. To the world, they were headlines. To Julia, they were chapters in a longer journey of the heart. What she longed for was never just the ceremony or the ring. It was sanctuary, a love that would endure when the cameras turned away. After years of heartbreaks that played out like unfinished scripts, Julia Roberts reached a point where exhaustion eclipsed triumph. She was famous beyond measure, beloved by millions, her face on billboards from Los Angeles to Tokyo. Yet privately, she was adrift. A woman who had survived storms of love lost and dreams undone, still yearning for a harbor. In 2000, while filming The Mexican, her path crossed with cinematographer Daniel Moder. He wasn't the leading man on a poster, not another actor vying for headlines, but someone who stood behind the camera, grounded, steady, unobtrusive. At the time, Daniel was still married, and the tabloids pounced. Whispers of scandal swirled with merciless persistence, but Julia and Daniel chose silence. They refused to let gossip write their story. What mattered wasn't the frenzy outside, but the stillness they discovered in each other's presence. He didn't see Julia the icon. He saw Julia the woman, vulnerable, real, longing for a love that belonged only to her. What began as friendship bloomed quietly into something deeper. Away from red carpets and premieres, Julia found in Daniel the one thing fame had denied her: peace. Where others admired me as a star, he cherished me as a person, she would later reflect. His loyalty wasn't dazzling like flashbulbs. It was steady like a heartbeat. And in that simplicity, she discovered the extraordinary. When Daniel's divorce was finalized, their relationship stepped into the light, not built in shadows, but on a foundation of clarity, choice, and truth. 2 years later, on July 4, 2002, Julia Roberts chose not a cathedral of grandeur, but the open sky of a New Mexico ranch to write the next chapter of her life. The ceremony was so private that even some close friends only learned of it afterward. No paparazzi, no spectacle, just wildflowers nodding in the summer breeze, the expansive sky above, and two people whispering forever. Julia walked down that aisle not as Hollywood's queen, not as America's sweetheart, but as a woman who had finally found home. What followed wasn't spectacle, but healing. With Daniel, Julia welcomed 3 children, twins Hazel and Phineas in 2004, and Henry in 2007. For a woman once defined by dazzling premieres and record-breaking box office numbers, her proudest title became the simplest: Mom. "My life is mine," she would say, her voice soft but firm. "The life I've built with my husband and our children is the best thing. To wake up and be with them, that's everything." In those words was the quiet triumph of a woman who had at last claimed the ordinariness she once thought impossible. At their ranch, her days were no longer measured by scripts or premieres, but by breakfasts shared with her children, by laughter ringing through sunlit rooms, by the rhythm of a life lived far from Hollywood's chaos. Fame never disappeared entirely. She continued to choose projects that stirred her soul, but its glare dimmed beside the glow of her kitchen at dawn or the peace of evenings in the company of family.